So let me conclude. We have taken 40 minutes. So maybe if there are some questions, and I would really like to hear other people say something about it. So the way I try and understand this, for me to make sense of this particular kind of a problem, is to ask, how do I destabilize majority as a concept? What are the ways in which I can destabilize that as an idea? And destabilization of that as an idea, I mean, it's not that people haven't tried critiquing this homogeneous idea of a Hindu majority. It's not that there have not been enough people who have asked questions about this very artificial construction of a Hindu majority. What could it mean? How is it sustained, and so on? But yet, you know, like in every other struggle, you will probably need much more of effort, much more attempts to destabilize it in many different ways. And one of the ways is to actually repeatedly show how the majority, if you want to call it the Hindu majority, how it is actually composed of multiple minorities which go to make that up. So that is one form of the project which we would do in terms of looking at destabilizing majority as a concept. And therefore, you know, it is that idea which must be dismantled first. It is not strengthening minority, the idea of minority, that weakens the idea of majority. It is dismantling the idea of majority which becomes a very important task. I think for me it would be a very important task. And another very important part, and probably I'll stop with this particular point, is that in terms of how majority and minority function in discourse, in the way it is used, in the way it politically functions, very often they seem to function like mirror images of each other. And the mirror image idea between majority and minority is actually quite interesting, because one of the simple ways to understand how majority is, I mean, if you want to look at it in terms of the numbers, which if people want to talk about majority minority numbers, they are just the inverse of each other. There's a very close relationship between that, between the way in which you conceptualize majority and minority. And when you construct, if you want to have the notion of majority possible in a society, you first have to construct a question of an idea of minority, out of which the majority is constructed as a mirror image. In other words, just as much as the Raja of Mewar does not have his meaning, the values which he attains without the presence of Alauddin Khilji, it's impossible for us to have any meaningful notion of idea of a Hindu majority without constructing specific forms of minority like Muslim minorities. And there is a lesson in that. I mean, there is also politics in that. And you know, one can talk about how we respond to it, what we do with it, etc. But which I'm sure there are any questions, we can talk about it. But for me, as I said today, I thought I wanted to take this opportunity to actually reflect a little bit more on what those concepts are, how those concepts arise, and how they get sustained. Because at one level, including in my work with Gopal and our new work which we have just finished, which is on this forms of making sense of social concepts. How do they arise? What sustains them? Why is it so difficult to get rid of them? And for that, we believe that it's important to be able to see the origins of these concepts and to see the forces which keep them, sustain them, and keep them active in society. So I apologize if it was very abstract and it didn't make sense. But as I said, it's a set of things which I've been struggling with, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share these points with you, and also look forward to questions or criticisms or clarifications. Thank you.
I have some questions.
Sure. No difficult questions.
So no difficult questions is the only condition Sundar has. Thank you for such an interesting and I'm sure all of us have many questions after the talk, I kept on thinking, yes, minorities definitely, it's not easy to conceptualize minority as a number because we all, I'm sure, agree that majority is not necessarily huge numbers. But then going beyond numbers, do we also go beyond experiences? This is something that he and Guru have talked a lot about. So how do we understand experience and numbers together or separate or as constituting a minority? Right? Minority as constituted by experience, our day-to-day experience, which make us feel small, if not in number, but in otherwise. So open to questions. Yeah, no difficult ones.
See, when you have given the example of apple and orange, the construction of the idea of majority, I don't think it is that simple to look at. I think in the concept of majority, there is a process of converting apple into orange. See, initially we thought only upper caste can attack Dalit. Then that idea of that shifted to OBCs and other, in some areas that happened. OBCs started attacking them. And that is one thing, the changing nature of the fruit into one. And another thing is, sometimes the apple also can taste like orange. So the characters of Hindutva, maybe you can call it Sanskritization or Hinduization, whatever. So in the idea of majority, the process is there. We include all the minorities into the majority concept in the name of religion or something. And if minority doesn't feel that they are minority, it's difficult to fight back the majority. So that's what I think.
Sure. Okay, no, I think that's very valid, but let me just clarify. I think it's a very important point you're making. What I'm saying is, from the kind of ways in which we are trying to make sense of the movements across India in creating this idea of a Hindu majority. Okay, I don't know what other people's experiences are, but with whatever experiences I have, I find that as actually, very strong. I mean, in a place like Karnataka, which I would not have, which I thought would have had far more resistance, you'll be really surprised to see how much this kind of ways of talking about Hindu majority, the commonality of sharing notions of Hindu, whatever the Hindu identity, with people across the nation has become so much a part of it. And for many of them, it's not even about different, and I think the process you're saying is an extremely important, and that also happens. But I'm saying that what is already happening at the first level, okay, I'm talking about that, which is that to be able to convince people who had such a wide, vast difference between the idea of Hindu identity with others in Northeast or even in Uttar Pradesh or Himachal and so on, with, let's say, some places in the south. What is the process which allows that facile bringing together of these terms? How did these people suddenly begin to see that commonality with them? That's all I'm saying. That doesn't mean that there are many other projects. Coercive projects are part of it, of course. But even without coercive projects, this kind of discovery of common conceptual terms, which allows them to all come under the same umbrella. And what worries me is that there is a lot happening without the coercive process. Where you convert the apple to orange. I'm saying that willingness of apples and oranges to be classified as fruits without resistance, that is the point I was talking about. And you have added another very important dimension, which is very problematical, but definitely talking about urban and semi-urban areas. What worries me is this far more easier, coming together under very artificially constructed concepts.
Understood you. The whole construction of minorities coming from the majoritarian constructions. If we look at the minority in real-term politics of minority, they have their own subjective understanding and dynamisms to define their own minority. So in your lecture, the most part, I mean, most of the construction coming from them. How do we understand the minorities themselves, the construction of minority from themselves, from their own perspective?
Yeah. Okay. As I said, what I was trying to make sense of is, as at one level, first as a response to Appadurai's point, and I think the way he frames it is an interesting question to ask. What is it that makes the larger number fear the smaller number? So it's a very provocative title, at least very captivating title, I think, if not anything else. So the question about numbers and minority majority is, I think, a very deeply troubling question. And so one way to do it, like she said, would be to go into questions of experience and look at the notion of what constitutes the experience of a minority as against the experience of a majority. And that has its own kinds of difficulties to deal with. When does an experience of a minority, is it self-recognized? Does a minority who has that recognizes it as a minority experience? Do all minorities have the same experience of feeling minorities, and so on? I mean, when you enter the domain of using experience to talk about it, these are some of the questions which come about. So, as you say, you could have minorities which self-classify them as minorities. There is absolutely, that happens all the time. But the point you will also have to recognize within that fact of minority is that what they are doing is actually very similar to the way in which a majority constructs concepts to put people under a majority. And that's why the shift between a minority becoming majority or majority breaking up into many minorities is always there. Because the way in which the dynamics in which by which you do it is very similar. Minorities construct minorities also in very similar ways. In ways in which you discover, it could be, we focus so much on religion, we forget that actually you can draw upon many other different, we often draw on different kinds of other concepts to bring some of us together as a group. This idea of group formation under the name of minority is really is the point. And what I'm saying is, as a social dynamic, the way in which minority comes together as minority is not necessarily very different from the way sometimes in which the majority comes together as majority. And that doesn't delegitimize it. It's a very important form of response or reaction. But it is it's a form of, the real larger question, and this is actually the work with Gopal, which we just finished, is actually, it's called Experience and the Everyday Social. We're the last part of doing this. And it's actually about the question of how does a collection become a social? That's a real question which we've really been struggling with. Because what constitutes a sociality? And the question we began with is, what constitutes the sociality of caste? In other words, what is it that distinguishes a caste grouping together, the togetherness of caste, if you like, of a particular caste, or the togetherness of a particular religion, or togetherness of people from HCU, for example. Those socialities which characterizes the feeling of saying, I am from HCU, I am from this caste, I am from this religion. All of them in terms of numbers are just aggregations, they are just things which come together. But all of them have very special notions of belongingness and socialities. And that's really what we have tried to make sense of, in trying to make sense of how these socialities arise. And in that sense, I'm saying, if you like, if I can rephrase it that way, that what we need to critically look at is whether the socialities of becoming minority and the socialities of becoming majority, what kind of differences are there really there? Sometimes, could it be that those socialities are very similar? Is one question we can ask.
Firdaus, Prashant and Tahir in that order.
One very obvious example, like narrative that came to my mind when you were speaking is When Phule conceptualizes the idea of a Bahujan like a Bahujan identity, as against, not as something majoritarian at that time, but against something dominant, which is the Aryan myth and everything. So he is constructing the idea of a majority in terms of number, in terms of experience, in terms of experience of operation, etc. But sense of majority in a very different way than the way in which you were speaking about how majority is constructed. So how do you, does construction of majority in the terms of say Bahujan, an example, necessarily need not imply dominance? But like when you were speaking in terms of categories of majority and minority, it, I don't know, I may be wrong in understanding, but it seemed that breaking off of the two categories of oppositional, this thing, that trap needs to be broken away from. But does majority necessarily imply dominance when you were speaking? With the example that you were giving.
Okay.
Another, like how would you look at the Bahujan discourse in that sense? Another thing I felt which was very useful, disconnected from this, but this idea is also very useful, but for example, think in terms of how even in progressive movements or in, we use the term say sexual minority. So to imagine that any queer attitudes or embodiments are minority embodiments is something which can be problematized using this idea that you were proposing, because then if you say that being queer is not a minority function, then it challenges everything, the way we are organizing relations around us.
Okay. There are many interesting points. Let me briefly try and address the question of dominance. So one way in which we can, which I can respond is this. Dominance between groups or communities or individuals are present. Okay. Do I need the categories of minority and majority to highlight the question of dominance? That is, what function do these terms of majority and minority do, which will add more meaning to the question of dominance and power between, let's say, two individuals or two communities? So let's say, I don't know if that's clear. So let's say there is an individual A or a community A dominating in some power relation with the community B. Then, in terms of understanding the nature of the dominance and the social dynamics between these communities, does the use of concepts like minority and majority add anything more to that question of analysis? That's all. In other words, what you're asking